So welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we're going to be hearing about the book Sexy but Psycho, written by Dr. Jessica Taylor, and it's discussed by Minakshi Bastapure. Welcome, Minakshi, and over to you.
Thank you, Jo. Hello, everyone. I'm Minakshi. I'm from India. I'm 23 years old, turning 24 next month. I'll be discussing Sexy but Psycho, which is written by Dr. Jessica Taylor. I'll give a brief introduction about the author. Dr. Jessica Taylor is a working class feminist author, chartered psychologist, speaker, and a researcher with a PhD in forensic psychology. And in this book, she draws on case studies, interviews with women and mental health professionals, new data and research to analyze the way society labels women as sexy but psycho. Okay, so first in the first chapter, she lists down all the myths that we still believe about mental illness and human trauma. She first begins by arguing about what constitutes mental health and the debate that is going in between the mental health industry about what is the definition of mental health, what is the definition of mental illness, what is the definition of trauma, and so on. She also describes that most people believe that mental health issues or psychiatric disorders and personality disorders are scientific and proven classification of illnesses, but we are unaware of how unscientific the process of inventing and agreeing new disorders and treatment actually is. So the DSM, which is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is considered the Bible of psychiatry. It was first published in 1952, and it is a manual that it was a way to provide a manual for doctors and psychiatrists to recognize and diagnose people with mental disorders. So while we don't use the term mental disorder in public anymore, but everything that is listed in the DSM is a mental disorder. It is perceived to be a mental disorder and it is treated as a mental disorder. The DSM is and always have been decided by an elite group of middle-class white male psychiatrists who sit around a table and decide what is normal and what is abnormal. The process of DSM development and inclusion is conducted using a vote within a select group of psychiatrists. So these white male psychiatrists, they sit around a table and they decide what is abnormal, what is normal. And there have been attempts at positioning DSM as a medical manual, so DSM has had 5 versions published so far, and with every revision of a DSM has increased the number of mental disorders listed in it exponentially. So the first DSM was published in 1952, which had 128 number of mental disorders listed in it. In 2013, they published DSM-5, which has 541 mental disorders listed in it. So with every publication of DSM, with every new mental disorder being listed in the DSM, the mental health industry is making millions out of it. She then, as we know, that the expression of emotion is much more than a scientific set of characteristics. It has a lot to do with culture and social norms than science. For example, in India, at a funeral of a loved one, people cry out loudly in public, and you won't see alcohols being served at funerals much in India. But in Western countries, crying out loud at a funeral is rarely seen, and emotions are masked with alcohol. You see that emotions have a lot to do with culture and social norms. She then lists down the myths and misconceptions of mental illness and mental health. First one being that mental health issues are genetic and passed down through families, which is not true. There is currently no proof that psychiatric diagnosis or issues result from a mutation of any single gene. Secondly, there is no real way of separating nature from nurture. And if we were to consider that mental illness is indeed genetic, then brings the next question, that is the person helpless and defined by their inescapable mental disorder for the rest of their life? will no amount of community support help that person, because it is after all caused by their genes, right? Second myth is that mental health issues are caused by chemical imbalance in the brain. Even today, there is no way of testing brain chemical imbalances. Even the American Psychiatric Association now denies ever supporting brain chemical imbalances theory. Now, some people might say that, oh, I feel better when I take the antidepressants, and therefore that is proof that the antidepressant cure the brain chemical imbalance in my brain. But Dr. Taylor says that this is logically flawed. If I take 2 paracetamol tablets for my headache and my headache goes away, I still don't know what caused the headache, right? The headache was certainly not caused by needing more paracetamol levels in my bloodstreams, for sure. Third myth is mental health issues are for life and that they can only be managed but not cured, which is not true. As we know that since birth, we go through a lot of experiences in our life, and we are a product of all of our experiences. When we are subjected to traumatic experiences, those memories will stay with us for the rest of the lives, which is also true for the good memories that we have. Those good memories also stay with us for the rest of our lives. There will be times where the trauma doesn't impact our daily life, but there will be also some time where the trauma is triggered and we are experiencing trauma responses, which is normal. But the psychiatry may call this that you relapsed, that for a long time you were in remission and then you relapsed. Fourth misconception is that mental health issues are rare, which is also not true. So from the trauma-informed perspective, we know that every person goes through trauma or distress everywhere. It can be anything. It can be exploitation at the workplace, academic stress, or death of a loved one, or some health complication, or accident, or breakup, anything, or political tension in your country. It is an universal experience, not a rare occurrence, which means that physical and psychological responses to those experiences are also universal. So if something is so common that everyone will experience it, why are we describing it as some abnormality or disorder at all? Then there are some neo-myths and present-day issues in psychiatry. One being that one of the most common neo-myths in children's social services is the reason why teenage girls continue to be exploited and trafficked is because they are going through an adolescent development phase in which they are addicted to risk-taking and dopamine release. Also, that teenage girls freeze during sexual assault because assault and they don't try to fight back is because their brains aren't mature enough to process what is being done to them. This myth comes from a bias that we adults, we have a better and we are better and wiser than teenagers. If freeze response is due to lack of mature brain in teenage girls, then why do adults also respond with a freeze response to danger and violence? Second, if we were to believe that adolescent brains were categorically different from adults, then surely as we grow with age, then the statistics of abuse and exploitation should drop dramatically. As we are getting more mature, we are taking less risks, as that theory suggests. Moving on to the second chapter. Next slide, please. In second chapter, Dr. Jessica Taylor discusses the history of psychiatry and the deep-rooted sexism, homophobia, and racism in the psychiatry. So for us to understand our present, we have to look at our past and try to understand it. There is a growing effort to establish psychiatry as a real medical science, and many people are buying into it, but they are also unaware of the history of psychiatry, which is filled with the ruling class using their biases and claiming those biases to be scientific facts to oppress marginalized communities and dissenters like Black people, homosexuals, women, or people who don't conform to social stereotypes, etc. To give you an example of how unscientific psychiatry can be, in 20th century, the Nobel Prize was awarded to Dr. Julius Wagner, who came up with a therapy in which it is a practice of deliberately injecting patients in asylum with malaria to induce fevers, which were believed to then cure the patient of madness. The most powerful thing about being framed as mentally ill or diagnosed as mentally ill is that the more you fight back, the more you protest, the more it is taken as evidence that you are indeed mentally ill. You are so mentally ill that you are in denial about being mentally ill. There was a mental health, there was a psychiatric disorder called drapetomania, which said that mental illness, which was a mental illness that caused enslaved Black people to want to escape from slave owners, plantations, and oppressors. So they created a mental health disorder for people who simply wanted to escape their slavery. During the 1920s and 1970s, the USA sterilized as many Black women as possible, usually by diagnosing them with psychiatric disorders. They were declared mentally defective in order to stop them from having their own children. Black people who protested in civil rights movements and anti-racism demonstrations were often diagnosed with protest psychosis. Being female was literally classified as a mental disorder for centuries. The concept of hysteria itself is thought to originate from the ancient Greek physician who wrote that the uterus was a problematic organ. For gay people, before it was considered a mental illness, it was first considered to be a form of demonic possession. Gay men were criminalized under sodomy law. The history of lesbian women is undocumented, like the history of women in general. But there has been research that shows that lesbian women were more likely to be they were less likely to be criminalized, but more likely to be found in psychiatric services. For example, in the 1950s, in UK, lesbian women were put into insulin coma to cure their sexuality. There is another mental health diagnosis or theory of herd mentality and crowd behavior that was published in 1985. That theory theorizes that poor people behaved in uncivilized ways in crowd because a crowd removed their identity and turned them into aggressive, primitive thinkers that turned into a group mind, which would in turn be manipulated and controlled by governments and mass media. Now, this theory, psychologists did not consider that people of higher social class could be caught by group mindset too. And in the present day psychiatry, it has not changed. It has not changed much. The research shows that women with BPD are much more likely, BPD diagnosis are much more likely to be lesbian or bisexual than heterosexual, and that their sexuality changing or being questioned is often cited as evidence of their changing and unstable identity issues. Being non-conforming to the sex stereotype is also considered a mental disorder. Even though it is being publicly denied that it is a mental disorder, the DSM-5 still lists it as a mental disorder only. Talking from my personal experience, I'm glad that I did not go consult any psychologist when I was in teenage years, because they would have definitely diagnosed me with gender dysphoria and told me that it is something inside my head and not because of the cultural and social imposition on me to act in a certain way. Then, in the slide you can see it is a NHS statistics on NHS restraint used between October 2020 to February 2021. You can see that when majority of all violent attacks and crimes in the world or on NHS staff are committed by men, we see that still teenage girls are the most chemically restrained. They are being chemically restrained more than once per week using forced injections of tranquilizers. But the same NHS data shows that men and boys are being physically restrained and placed in seclusion or isolation rooms to calm them. Is that the distress of women and girls is so pathologized that professionals believe it warrants restraining them and then forcibly injecting them for their own good? Or is it that male anger and aggression is so so normalized and tolerated that professionals don't see it as abnormal or disorder and therefore don't seek to tranquilize them. Or maybe is it that women and girls making fuss is so problematic that it's easier to just inject them with tranquilizers and chemicals, shut them up, and leave them to sleep for days? Is this progress really? In the book, the statistics is mostly from the Western world, but I have the statistics for India also. The total male to female ratio of psychiatric outpatient records in 3 general hospitals from 2019 to 2020, which was seen in one study, was 1 man to 1.69. That is the male to female ratio. Next slide. In the next chapter, she dives into the history of perfect woman and crazy woman. For thousands of years, women have been classified as the inferior sex, both physically and mentally. But this was not powerful enough for patriarchy to live this long, because it would only take a demonstration by a handful of women to prove that they were not inferior and they were just as much capable as men, and patriarchy would crumble away. So men went much further than simply suggesting that women are bad at math. They deliberately and persistently described and treated women as unreliable, unstable, evil, crazy, and dangerous. This way, no matter what women did or said or invented or reported or attempted, it could be positioned as a hysterical lie, a malicious accusation, or as the mad rabblings of a crazy woman. Historically, the concept of the ideal woman has barely changed in centuries. The ideal woman is beautiful, young, heterosexual, feminine, childbearing, obedient, submissive, polite, committed, faithful, virginity, sexually available at all times to her husband, however he wants, whenever he wants. And any deviation from this ideal has historically and even today been used to diagnose or medicate or imprison or even kill women. Historically, these women were called witches. Today, they are called disorder. Don't be a witch or we'll kill you. Even if you're not one, we can accuse you of being a witch, and the weight of that accusation would be enough to have you killed anyway. In this quote, replace the word witch with the word crazy and killed with sectioned or treated or medicated. Don't be crazy or we'll section you. Even if you're not one, we can accuse you of being crazy, and the weight of that accusation would be enough to have you sectioned anyway. That way, you get traditional psychiatry. Now, replace the word crazy with the term borderline or emotionally unstable. Don't be borderline, or we will section you. Even if you're not one, we can accuse you of being borderline, and the weight of that accusation would be enough to have you medicated anyway. That is modern psychiatry. As of today, being female is widely reported as correlating with almost every mental health disorder in the DSM-5. Women are also more likely to be diagnosed with multiple psychiatric disorders at one time. I know a case of a woman who was known for, she liked roaming around freely. She used to get mad at men when they tried to touch her, or even people who tried to harm her emotionally. Her family took her to a psychiatrist to cure her of this mental illness, and she was put on medication for her anger issues. So what we see is that the common collective global trauma of women due to misogyny has been reframed as this made-up psychological disorder that is inside the brains of mentally disordered individual women and girls. That is patriarchy at work. Next slide. In chapter 4 dives into the reframing of women's trauma as mental illness. So as a girl becomes a woman and moves through her life, the changes of her being subjected to trauma are very high. What might be considered a disorder or mental health issue seems pretty rational and normal when we consider that what women and girls are up against. So about postpartum depression or psychosis. We know that pregnancy and childbirth poses many physical, emotional challenges to the woman. It changes her body, her career prospects, family dynamics, daily routine, etc. On top of this, research shows that domestic violence increases when women are pregnant, yet women are increasingly being diagnosed with postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. Their responses are considered abnormal and dangerous to their baby, the baby who is considered as the real victim in this situation. And the baby is not considered the victim of domestic violence, but of a mentally ill mother. About BPD and EUPD, which is bipolar disorder and emotionally unstable personality disorder. 75% of all diagnoses of BPD are women, even in India, around 70% are women. How can anyone have a personality disorder when personality in itself is a debated concept? Personality is flexible, we know it's dynamic, it's nuanced, it's virtually impossible to pin it down to some boxes. The diagnostic criteria for BPD is so wide and so broad that any woman who is traumatized can be diagnosed with it. Many gentle practitioners, social services, police services, etc., flag a female patient with BPD diagnosis as a high-risk person. Women with this diagnosis can be treated as if they are unstable, unreliable, or exaggerating when they call emergency services for help. We see that the modern message of end mental health stigma is an oxymoron. It is impossible to end stigma against people who are being diagnosed with mental disorders. Isn't psychiatry just a legitimate way of stigmatizing and isolating people who are profoundly different? Like, we see dissenters being diagnosed with mental disorders and sent to psychiatric asylums. The only way to end stigma is to stop making psychiatric diagnoses and focus more on humanistic approaches to supporting humans in distress. Then there are the ACEs, that are adverse childhood experiences. These scores are basically, these are questionnaires that check adverse experiences the person was subjected into childhood, like abuse, rape, or broken family, etc. And a score is given out of 10. Higher score indicates a higher risk for health problems later in life. Checking ACE scores for pregnant women. These scores are being checked for pregnant women to decide whether the mother is fit enough to keep her baby. The message is clear here. If you were abused in childhood, then you're unfit for your whole life. You're unfit to be a mother. In Australia, these ACE scores are already being used to assess applications for life insurance and health insurances. They are also being used as explanations for male violence too. If childhood abuse can lead men to be violent offenders, why isn't the same the case for women? Why aren't women committing vast majority of the suicide bombing or violent crimes? Next slide. Using psychiatry against women and girls subjected to male violence. So this chapter discusses abuse of women who have been pathologized, medicated, and sectioned and labeled after they reported male violence. Professionals are told that getting women diagnosed proves that the perpetrator psychologically harmed them, but then that diagnosis is used against the woman to claim that their disclosures of male violence are fantasy or malicious, that they're unreliable, they're exaggerating. Ultimately, the cases are dropped because of the diagnosis that was initially encouraged as a good practice. Many women, when they find the courage to speak up about what they have been subjected to, only to find themselves in a psychiatric ward or on daily medication that makes them feel ill. I personally know a woman who gathered the courage to talk to her parents about child sexual abuse she endured at home, only to be taken to a psychiatrist and diagnosed with PTSD and given medication. No action was taken against the rapist, who is now married. She was gaslit by her family to the point that she now claims the rape never happened, that it was a figment of her imagination, or that it was a consensual relationship. He never raped her, and when she was in primary school, and that it was her delusion. The abortion also never happened. But I clearly remember that all of that happened. The chapter also discusses the attitudes of male psychiatrists at mental health wards. A majority of the female patients that come into the unit are diagnosed with EUPD, and many of the psychiatrists are male who prefer to work with females, which is code word, which is a red flag. Yes, so the women in the ward, they had trauma in common, like rape, abuse, violence. These section women are perceived as attention seeking by these male professionals, and they are often put on heavy medication. And when it doesn't work, when the medication doesn't work, they are put on even higher dosage. Male professionals also seem to talk about their female colleagues when they disagree with, as if they are one of their delusional, problematic, outspoken patients who need to be nicer to them. We all are aware about powerful men who put their wives in psychiatric wards or on heavy medication when they registered or disclosed domestic violence. I know of a case where an abusive doctor, so the husband is a doctor who got his wife diagnosed and put her on medication, which made her chronically exhausted. She would then get easily irritated and angry because she was exhausted. And this irritation was used by her in-laws to justify why he was abusive to her. It did not come to their mind that her irritation, he was the source of her irritation. He was the one abusing her. It was okay. Then one of the most common stereotypes of a mentally ill woman is that of a crazy, obsessed ex-girlfriend. Framing a woman like this makes her instantly unreliable and discredited, which is deliberate because whatever she has to say, the man doesn't want anybody to know about it. Many men use this technique to prevent the former partner they abused from alerting the current or potential partners of his abusive behavior. Men often use this stereotype in custody battles against their former partners. Now, we instinctively know not to talk about mental health issues when we are in the courtroom, when someone brings our mental health into question in the matters of male violence, because we know that the moment they're questioning our mental health, we know that the man is going off the hook. Next chapter. Next slide, please. Pathologizing women and girls in the courtroom. For many women who are pathologized and diagnosed with psychiatric disorders, their worst nightmare is to end up in a courtroom. Whether they're going through a divorce or a custody battle or they're a victim in a criminal trial, having a mental health diagnosis on their file is usually a recipe for discrimination, gaslighting, and injustice. This chapter describes the way psychiatric and psychological assessment and diagnosis are being used in the courtroom, often without any right to appeal or retract. In some cases, the mere suggestion of mental disorder is enough to frame a woman as totally incapable of telling the truth. To give an example, there is one example in the book that where the woman's abusive ex-husband mocked her for her mental health diagnosis of EUPD. And then when the matter went to court, and after the court case, she gained access to all of her mental health records. And she noticed that none of the abuses she reported were mentioned in the mental health documents. And the whole reason she was seeking mental health support was due to male violence, and yet it was never recorded. Instead, all there were years of comments about her personality and emotions. Maybe because if the professionals had acknowledged that her so-called symptoms were due to male violence, they would have to step in and protect her and her unborn child from a violent offender, which is a more difficult job than labeling her as crazy. Family court is not the only place where women have their mental health diagnosis used against them. There is a large increase in the occurrence of the delusion defense in cases where women report men for domestic abuse or sexual violence. What's interesting is that it's very easy. Once you utter the word delusion, one said it is for the woman to prove that she is not delusional. And how do you prove you're not delusional? Because the more you deny, the more disordered you are. Then there is also the term projection that is used against women when they disclose domestic or sexual violence. In one case, I have read of cases in India where the court said that the mother is projecting her marital disputes or past trauma onto the child and making them say awful things about their father. So if she doesn't report that her child is being sexually abused by the father, she is neglectful and dangerous. If she does report, then she is delusional and malicious. She can't win. One accusation of a woman being crazy is enough to discredit any abuse done to her by men. One mental health accusation or diagnosis can change the entire proceeding. Next slide, please. This chapter describes how the field of medicine and psychiatry has positioned women's reproductive processes as evil, dirty, or crazy or disorder. So there are two main patterns around women who seek help from medical services. First, when their physical symptoms, illnesses, and injuries are described as mental health issues or exaggeration or fabrication. Their trauma, their fears, sadness, or distress are described as just physical, chemical, or biological issues with the brain. So basically, whatever she is saying, it's the exact opposite of that. If she says it's a physical issue, then it's in her head. When she says she is being abused or harmed, it's also in her brain, but with some biochemical issue. So everything she says can be ignored and dismissed as if it is just a figment of the imagination in the head of a hysterical woman. Throughout history, periods have been demonized and framed as evil and dirty by religious institutions. This has influenced the field of medicine as well. In the 20th century, doctors stated that a woman's mental illness was inseparable from her ovaries and uterus, and that gynecological issues were always linked to psychiatric issues and vice versa. Even today, in 21st century, that mindset is still there. DSM-5 lists premenstrual dysphoric disorder is listed there. And the diagnostic criteria for this disorder is so broad that almost every woman can be diagnosed with it. And it is also, and we see that whenever a woman is acting, quote unquote, acting out of her character, becoming angry, upset, tearful, anxious, or annoyed, the question tends to be, is she on a period? Then menopause. In the 20th, by the 1930s, menopause being described as a deficiency disease of women, and they started to be prescribed synthetic estrogen, which would later become one of the most common treatments in the Western world. Despite 1 in 10 women of reproductive age having endometriosis, women are routinely told that their symptoms are psychological, that they're mentally ill, or that they're exaggerating their pain. The doctors have also been prescribing contraceptive pills to women and girls to not only prevent pregnancy, but also to control their moods and emotions, despite there being serious side effects of the contraceptive pills. So we see that no matter what health issues women report to their doctor, it may be something related to reproductive health or heart attack or cancer or botched-up surgery, women are still more likely to be ignored, minimized, or diagnosed with a mental health issue. When women and girls disclose abuse and harm, their trauma is rarely acknowledged or addressed, and they are incorrectly diagnosed with personality disorders or mental health issues like BPD, PTSD, eating disorder, etc. So how can we possibly trust the medical profession if we know that so much of their decisions and treatments and theory and practice are colored by their beliefs that women are exaggerating, manipulative, and over emotional? Next slide. This chapter, Sexualizing Crazy Women and Sectioning Sexually Non-Conforming Women. So basically, psychotic women are sexy, they are sexualized, and non-sexual women are psychotic, they are medicated. As a woman, you cannot escape the inevitable psychiatric diagnosis, which will come as soon as you disclose abuse and trauma. So recently I watched a movie which was produced by Priyanka Chopra Jonas named Firebrand. In that, the female protagonist, she was raped when she in her childhood. She, with the help of an NGO, she went to court, got her degree, and won the case against her perpetrator. But she developed a coping mechanism or trauma response, and she was not ready to have sex with any man ever. She knew that, but the male protagonist proposes her for marriage, and she declines him, saying that I won't be able to have sex with you. But the man says that that's fine. I want emotional connection with you, not sexual gratification. So they get married. And years forward, we see that she's still having problem with having sex. And they're going to a mental health professional who tells her that whenever she gets flashbacks or a daily exercise, that stand in the front of the mirror and describe everything that you went through, like a story to yourself while you're standing in front of the mirror. Do this every day. And she's doing this every day. And in the end, she gets bored of it and annoyed of it. And then she's finally ready to have sex with her husband. So we see that there is a clear entitled from men that they feel entitled to women's bodies. And even though women say no, they still want their bodies. And the mental health industry or the psychiatry diagnoses women or positions them as the one with problems if the woman doesn't want sex. So these women, we are clearly traumatized or affected by male violence and threat of male violence. All of us are, or by pregnancy complications. But then, because of which we are not desiring sex with men or not being able to have sex, many women not being able to have sex despite their desire, but due to the flashbacks of child sexual abuse or rape. They are being referred for psychosexual problems. And then there is sexy but psycho, the sexualization of the mentally disordered woman. We are witnessing a slow and steady normalization of sexualization of women's trauma. Male characters that prey on chicks with daddy issues are being normalized through mass media. For example, Barney Stinson from How I Met Your Mother. Different kind of merchandise is being sold for men and women with slogans like cute but psycho, hot but psycho, etc. Films now portray sexualized, psychotic, delusional ex-girlfriend and wife stalking men, whilst men stalking women is still portrayed as true love and persistence pays off. For example, Harley Quinn from Suicide Squad. She's depicted as having come from a broken home with an abusive family, groomed and abused, beaten and controlled by the Joker, who is loved by millions of men worldwide, who then kicked her into boiling acid. She was sexualized for ultimately being an extremely traumatized, sexualized, controlled victim of torture and abuse. Her depiction became an instant hit, with thousands of similar sexy but psycho merchandise being sold worldwide. Then there is the Disney legacy. We know that there is a link between Disney franchise, the female stars, their sexualization, and then their subsequent breakdowns and the pathologization. For example, Miley Cyrus, Selena Gomez, Demi Lovato, Britney Spears, all of them. I remember watching Wrecking Ball when I was a teenager, the video of Wrecking Ball, and thinking, why is she crying, looking into the camera with a shaved head? What is the purpose of that? Then there is the hot, crazy matrix. So in 2018, a research study was featured in a top academic journal. The paper features the diagram that is on the first figure in the slide, which is presented by the authors without any clarification that it comes from a YouTube video. So this diagram comes from a YouTube video, and this diagram was used in an academic research journal. As you can see on the x-axis, which measures hot, begins at 0. And the y-axis that measures crazy, it begins at 4, which means that there is no such thing as a sane and emotionally stable woman. The study used women like BPD as the category of exploration as crazy, which in itself should tell us what academics and researchers really think about psychiatric diagnosis. You can see majority of the women are confined to the no-go zone. If she's crazy and hot, then okay. But if she's crazy and unattractive, she holds no value to women. She holds no value to men. Next. Chapter 10, Lifelong Trauma Reframed as Incurable Madness. Once diagnosed with mental health disorders, women find themselves in a bottomless pit of medical misogyny. Once diagnosed, they only ever move from remission to relapse and then back to remission with no cure. We know that our memories and feelings of trauma are naturally triggered and reprocessed at different stages of life. But this is often taken as evidence that psychiatric diagnoses are incurable lifelong issues. Human emotions are complex. There are many kinds of human suffering that may result in lifelong trauma. There is happiness, there is sadness, there is birth, there is death. You may feel happy by remembering something good from your childhood in your old age. Similarly, you may feel sad by remembering something bad, traumatic from your childhood in your old age. Then there is this Stockholm syndrome and battered woman syndrome. So Dr. Jessica Taylor gives one example of a woman named Helen who was diagnosed with PPT after years of domestic violence, and she was sectioned for 13 years. She was seeking counseling. Her counselor told her she stayed with her abuser because of trauma bonding, Stockholm syndrome, battered woman syndrome. All of these diagnoses are based on victim blaming and misogyny. What this diagnosis says is that women who are abused by men don't escape the abuse because they develop a maladaptive passivity to the pain and eventually give up trying to escape or because of learned helplessness. What all of these syndromes seem to ignore is that women who are being controlled and abused by men have very little choice but to stay and form some form of attachment if it weren't there already, caused by the deliberate grooming process of the man abusing them and the family of the woman and the man. A depiction. So if a woman is too scared to try to escape her abuser, then Stockholm syndrome, battered woman syndrome. But if she gathers the courage to escape her abuser, then she has PTSD, BPD, EUPD, or HPD, etc. This is peak misogyny because no matter what a woman does, there is always a mental disorder diagnosis waiting for her. Thousands of women are being sectioned and medicated because the doctors and nurses keep calling or meeting their abusive partners, who of course agree that their victim is totally crazy and lying about being abused. Then there is euthanasia as a cure of women's madness. One other way women who are diagnosed with mental health disorders die is by the relatively new practice of psychiatric euthanasia. It is a practice that is legal in some countries that allows people to die by lethal drugs, given that 3 psychiatrists agree that there is no scope for improvement in their mental health and there is no reasonable alternative than dying. As we have seen how biased and unscientific mental health diagnoses are, if it is not surprising that vast majority of the people who have opted for euthanasia so far are women, often who were subjected to male violence. It is sinister that we see there is a growing demand or advocacy for abolishing death penalty, which argues that everybody deserves a second chance, and even the domestic abusers and rapists and serial killers can improve given the chance. On the other hand, we see and on the other hand, we see that the field of medicine and psychiatry there is a growing advocacy to allow women to die who are obviously like too traumatized by male violence and patriarchy and misogyny in general. I was watching one stand-up comedy special of Taylor Tomlinson. She asked her audience how many from the audience have been to therapy. And it's mostly the women in the audience who make noise. Taylor says that's the problem, but it is true. Women are more likely to be referred to mental health services. They're more likely to be diagnosed with disorders. They're also more likely to be considered damaged beyond repair to the point that death is the only cure. This is literally the system telling us women that we are mentally damaged on the very basis of being female. There is a problem with chemicals in women's brains and how we deal with problems in our life. Men have chemical balance inside their brain and they handle conflict with logic and soundness. We are witnessing the beginning of patriarchy using death as a treatment for women's trauma. Because why smash the patriarchy when you can prescribe death as a medicine to women? The message is simple: shut up or die. Next slide. So what can be done to cure this sick system? There are some points that Dr. Jessica Taylor has mentioned that can create a better world. First is stop sharing and using psychiatric misinformation. Second is commission an independent inquiry into the mass medication and psychiatric diagnosis of women and girls. Third is ban the use of psychiatric accusations when women disclose, report, or give evidence about male violence or abuse. Then adopt a trauma-informed approach to mental health at every level of every system. Challenge the misuse of ACEs, retrain the professionals, change the language and narratives being given to the general public. Next slide. Slide. Then challenge and disrupt misogyny. Remove funding from pharmaceutical companies and invest in accessible and free trauma therapy. Ban the use of ECT and psychiatric euthanasia for everyone and provide compensation for everyone harmed by psychiatric drugs. Most importantly, divorcing feminism from psychiatry. Because psychiatry is the patriarchy with prescription pad and a pen full of ink. We must stop calling each other crazy or bipolar, etc., even if we disagree or don't like each other. Also, we must not engage in any kind of psychiatric diagnosis of the oppressors also. Men oppress women because they are making an active choice of harming women, not because they are mentally ill. It is a matter of mindset, not illness. We must reject the pathologization and psychiatric medication of women and girls. Diagnosis and medication will not prevent or cure women's trauma. Ending misogyny definitely will. Every criticism of psychiatry or mental health industry mentioned in this book, I have found it to be true. One example being for the past few months, I have been researching into sex as self-injury, which is listed in the DSM-5. It is a term used to describe when adolescents engage in sex as a form of self-injury. Research suggests that adolescents who engage in sex as self-injury or sex as self-harm are more likely to have experienced sexual abuse or have more sexual partners and have higher levels of trauma symptoms. This means that once the girl is raped, she is going to have multiple partners and likely to be quote unquote re-victimized. That there is something about being raped that automatically makes her seek sex with multiple partners. It is not being questioned that whether the ratio of sexually abused boys engaging in sex as self-harm is equal to the ratio of sexually abused girls engaging in sex as self-harm. Or are there cultural messages there of what a woman's position is in bedroom and in society, the scripts of sexuality, what is sex and what is normal sex and whatever. That's what leading to sexual self-harm, like choke me daddy academic. This is 21st century, and even the trauma-informed professionals are biased against women. Last year, I was looking for a therapist for myself. I came across several prominent professionals in Pune who are trauma-informed and at the same time queer affirmative. You don't treat homosexual clients as demons, which is great, but how can one claim to be trauma-informed and yet believe or support concept of gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder? Despite there being no evidence of gay gene that determines the sexuality of a person, syllabus still says otherwise. In one of our lectures, in one of our psychology master's lectures, we were discussing ADHD and how the diagnosis doesn't mean that child is dumb or has no future. Many artists and athletes have ADHD. What struck me is that how can people not connect the dots here? If a child is into science and schooling and sits in the class and does the homework, then the child is normal. If the child doesn't like to sit in the classroom and likes to play in playground or do some art instead of homework, then the child is disordered. Aren't the biases of parents biases jeopardizing child's overall well-being here? The diagnostic criteria is getting so broad day by day that any one of us can be diagnosed with multiple personality disorders, even if you go to a psychologist, like in your first or second session only.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and women's liberation.
Minakshi, that was amazing. We will send you the chat, so because I guess you have not had time to see it yet, but we'll send it to you, and we very much hope you come on again soon to discuss another book, because you'll see from the chat it's incredibly very appreciated.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Great. Bye, everybody.